Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion of the film Cooked, Survival by Zip Code. The focus of the film is on the Chicago heat wave of 1995. Before we begin, I want to thank all of those who helped to make this event a possibility. Most especially, I want to thank Allison Walding and Sinead Condon, who provided logistical support and long hours and huge attention to detail to help make this event happen. I also want to thank Angela Reyes from DHDC and Molly Sweeney from 482 Forward, who introduced us to the idea of working with Detroit Public Television for events such as this. I also want to thank Zachary Allen from DPTV, who's providing technical support for our session this evening, and the members of the Community Action to Promote Healthy Environments Steering Committee and the Stakeholder Advocacy Board for the Michigan Life Stage Environmental Exposure and Disease Center, who helped to conceptualize this event and make it come to fruition. And finally, I want to send a particular thank you to Kimberly Hill-Knott, President and CEO of Future Insight Consulting, for her vision and her contributions to the planning of this event and her commitment to supporting small businesses as they work to harness their skills and energies to address climate change. As some of you may know, we initially scheduled this event as an in-person showing of the film, followed by a panel discussion back in March when we lived in a different world. That event was canceled as the COVID-19 pandemic struck the nation, and at that time we were uncertain if or when we would be able to reschedule this conversation. However, as the pandemic unfolded with particularly vicious impacts in Detroit neighborhoods, as well as predominantly Black and Brown neighborhoods nationally, it became clear that COVID-19 was following the same playbook as the Chicago heat wave. The urgency of the conversation has been highlighted in recent weeks as protests against police violence have underscored our failure as a country to yet realize underlying values of equity and social justice. The conversation that Cooked insists that we have is a conversation about the undeniable role of inequality in shaping the patterns of sickness and death in the United States. The 1995 Chicago heat wave resulted in the deaths of over 700 Chicago residents, most of whom were older African Americans living with limited economic resources. Fundamentally, it is about the role of systemic racism in restricting access to the resources that are necessary to maintain health and life, safe and stable housing, clean air, clean water, the ability to leave one's home without fear of violent encounters with the police, and the ability to access the resources needed to survive in the face of high heat, floods, and other environmental events linked with our changing climate. We look forward to this evening's conversation about extreme heat events and the social forces that place Black and Brown communities at heightened risk of adverse health effects and of death. This is a conversation about climate change and the increasing frequency of high heat events. It is a conversation about racism, disinvestment in predominantly Black urban communities, and the resulting inequitable, unfair, and unjust burden of death and disease. And most importantly, it is a conversation about long and short-term actions that we can take towards social, economic, and environmental justice. Before we begin, I want to start with a few introductions. First, a few of you may have noticed that by now that I am not Donele Wilkins, our featured facilitator for tonight's conversation. Unfortunately, Ms. Wilkins was called unexpectedly out of town last night due to a family emergency related to the protests against police violence that continue to unfold across the country. We wish Ms. Wilkins and her family safe travels and a fair and just resolution. I will be stepping in as a poor substitute for her incredible facilitation skills and keen insights on environmental justice issues. We are truly honored to have with us tonight a number of panelists who bring incredibly keen insights and expertise to our conversation. I want to begin by introducing Judith Helfand, the director and producer of Cooked, Survival by zip code, and the proud 2020 holder of the Bob Allison Endowed Chair in Media at Wayne State University's Department of Communication. We're delighted to have her join us today to discuss the motivation behind, the making of, and the implications of her film for efforts to address climate justice in Detroit and in the US more broadly. Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome, Senior Program Officer at the Kresge Foundation, where she is responsible for the Environment Program's portfolio on climate resilient and equitable water systems. Dr. White-Newsome earned a PhD in Environmental Health Sciences from the University of Michigan School of Public Health and is a leader in efforts to address climate change in health with a particular focus on socially and economically vulnerable communities. Our third panelist is Justin Owenu, a community organizer for the Detroit chapter of the Sierra Club. He was appointed by Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer as the youngest member to Michigan's first advisory council for environmental justice. In his spare time, Mr. Owenu served as one of 12 national appointees to the Council on Environment and Climate Justice, which just released a set of recommendations for the climate, energy, and environment and energy planks for the DNC. And finally, we're honored to have joining us tonight Dr. Trish Koman, Faculty Research Program Manager in the College of Engineering Multidisciplinary Design and a Research Investigator in Environmental Health Sciences at the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. Dr. Koman earned her PhD in Environmental Health Science from the University of Michigan School of Public Health after retiring from a 20-year career in public service with the Environmental Protection Agency. Her leadership and contributions have been recognized with 4 gold medals for exceptional service to the country and an APA Administrator Award for Excellence. Very briefly, the format for the evening will be as follows. We will begin our conversations by showing the trailer for the film Cooked, recognizing that some of you may not have had the opportunity to view the entire film before tonight, and those of you who were able to view it, this will be a moment to refresh your memories and bring in a few clips from the films. So we're going to begin by playing this 3-minute trailer. Next, we have a few questions for our panelists as a way of getting the conversation started about the film. And we invite those of you who are listening in to post your questions in the Facebook chat Facebook chat area, and our chat moderators will transfer those questions to me so that I can ask them of the panel. If we can't answer a question, if we're unable to answer a question that you pose live today, we are committed to getting answers to you by early next week. All of the questions asked today will be posted with answers on the website onedetroitpbs.org, which we will be posting at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Zachary, and he is going to play the movie trailer for us.
What's the best way to prepare for disaster? It's a question lots of people are asking these days as the planet heats up and we face one unprecedented disaster after another. My interest in disasters started with one specific disaster that took place in Chicago in July 1995, one of the deadliest heat waves in U.S. history so far.
We go to extremes in Chicago, and that's why people love Chicago. We go to extremes.
I walked into the room and I saw my grandmother lying across the bed, face up. I looked over at the window and it was nailed shut.
The sexiness for the news media was it was about the heat. But the real story is, why were people in these neighborhoods dying? People weren't dying on the north side. People weren't dying in the Gold Coast. People were dying on the south and west sides.
The minute you see the refrigerator trucks, that means there's so many dead bodies that the coroner doesn't have room for them anymore. That's enough.
I think it's really about the heat.
It's not really about the heat. There is no need for as much poverty in our community as there is.
story about these deeper social fault lines that make some members of a city vulnerable and keep others protected and blissfully ignorant about what's happening to people who live quite close to them.
Do you think they're addressing that?
Do I think the city is addressing the extreme poverty in communities of color in Chicago? Is that what you're asking me? Don't be ridiculous.
So what's the best way to prepare for disaster? I guess it depends on where you live.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Zachary. I want to invite our panelists to begin by commenting a bit on this film. And I first need to ask, because I don't see her, has Judith joined us yet?
Yeah, I'm here.
Perfect. Thank you, Judith. There. So Judith, the question that we'd like to ask each of the panelists to spend a few minutes talking about is, the question is, how do you see this film, which is based on a heat event in Chicago in 1995, as relevant to the city of Detroit now in 2020? And Judith, we'll invite you to begin.
I think that the reason I wanted to tell this story, originally why I wanted to tell this story was because I couldn't believe that one extreme weather event could reveal the underlying crisis that I certainly had not really understood before, which was what the long-term implications of structural racism were. And it saddened me, and I was in awe of the fact that we were relying on the disaster and crisis of the climate crisis and extreme weather to force us to really have to see the underlying slow motion crisis, as we call it in the film, that's really there all the time. We don't need a heat wave to show us that people are dying every single day of treatable diseases on the south and west sides of Chicago. That was true in 1995, but that's true right now in 2020. And I'm sure that that's true in parts of Detroit and in cities all across the country. And we're still relying on disasters to push us to have to look at what we're not dealing with and not looking at.
Thank you, Judith. Jalonne, would you like to go next?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Well, thank you so much, Amy and team and DPTV, the other panelists, and especially Judith for making this provocative, disturbing, yet unsurprising account of the disaster that happened in Chicago in 1995. But before jumping into my comments, I want to appreciate everybody in the city of Detroit, in Chicago, and other cities across this country that have and are being cooked, literally and figuratively, by the reality of racism. I remain hopeful, though, knowing that the existing and never failing resiliency of Black and Brown people across this country, they're going to continue to show up and show out and demand change in spite of. So my continued prayers are with everybody that is continuing to sacrifice their health, their lives, and their time to address these multiple crises that we are facing. So now that I'm a little bit older, I don't think it was a coincidence that I actually spent time in Chicago, and I was there during the heat wave of 1995. I was excited to begin a minority engineering program at Northwestern University, and I spent some time at the Taste of Chicago, hung out in Bronzeville with my great uncle, ate my deep dish pizza, rode the L to the south and west sides of the city. But what's surprising is that even after that summer, and even after spending 4 years at Northwestern University in one of the suburbs, I had no idea that this had happened. It had happened right under my nose. And as Judith put in her film, I was unintentionally ignorant. to not only what happened in Chicago, but the underlying structures that contributed to one of the worst man-made disasters in this country. In fact, it wasn't until about 15 years later that I actually picked up Eric Kleinenberg's book after moving back to Michigan. And I would then be a PhD student working for Marie O'Neill, where climate change was her focus in the School of Public Health. And then subsequently working with the Detroit Health Department because they were concerned about senior citizens being overheated in the high rises we have in the city. And that ultimately became the topic of my dissertation research. That included actually monitoring the temperatures of the homes of senior citizens throughout the city, sharing these findings, trying to give folks tips to stay healthy during hot weather, particularly with senior citizens and even members of my family. But again, little did I know that that one heat wave in 1995 and that experience that I had in a similar heat wave in France in 2003 would lend itself to this conversation today. But Amy, to answer the question you've posed, having grown up in Detroit and spent some time in Chicago, there are a couple of changes that I have noticed between 1995 and now. One change I would say is a little bit heightened awareness that at least in some communities, there's an understanding that extreme heat is invisible and dangerous. I will also say that now you do see it on the daily weather report sometime, the meteorologist actually talking about heat index and warnings and things we need to be careful of. And I've also seen some pretty nice city climate plans with some good stuff, some good elements that have been operationalized and some that haven't. So there has been a little bit of progress and a little bit of change. But however, there are some things that have not changed enough. And there are three pieces that I think for me make Chicago and Detroit strikingly similar. There are many others, but I'll highlight three. One, the failure to boldly address the institutional and systemic racism that Judith talked about that still contributes to our poor people, our houseless people, our people of color, and many others that are continuing to die from heat-related deaths. The second thing is that our Black and Brown communities remain disproportionately underprepared for these disasters, whether it's heat or any others. And last but not least, we are still Black and Brown folks invisible in responses to extreme heat, flooding, and many other crises that are made worse by climate change and our realities. So for me, while the title of the film, Cooked, is not only about people literally being cooked or overheated in their homes, it is also about that other definition of cooked, meaning the situation has been altered or falsified or something ain't right or is dishonest. And that is exactly why this film was relevant back then as it is to cities across America right now. The fact that we still have people dying from extreme heat, people dying from extreme police brutality, people dying from extreme poverty is a signal that there has and continues to be a lot of cooked, false, dishonest, and altered situations that continue to cause Black and Brown people to suffer the worst. So I'll stop there and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you for offering those very thought-provoking comments, Jalonne, and I look forward to coming back to those as part of the conversation. Justin, would you like to share your comments next?
I would, and thank you again for having me. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak with you all and have dialogue on this important topic. For me, I kind of first got introduced to environmental justice work because of natural disasters. I was in the South when Hurricane Katrina hit. I was in Houston when Hurricane Harvey hit. And for me, one of the things that I noticed in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey was not only just how ravaged the city was and how there were certain pockets of the city that were safe. The universities, the rich parts of towns were physically not as flooded as other parts of town. But even after the disaster, when it came to the recovery, people getting money and assistance from government and from nonprofit organizations was extremely disparate across racial lines and across economic lines. And so for me, that's how I got involved in this work. I started working with the Children's Environmental Health Initiative, which used to be located at U of M, and really tried to start to uncover a lot of the long-term impact of the storm that we're still seeing today. I think one of the things that stood out to me in doing that work is over a year and a half after the hurricane, I met families that still had mold in their homes, that had to move their children out of their bedrooms because the room was so overtaken by mold. And so for me, that was a wake-up call for how systemic and how deeply rooted a lot of these inequalities are. And I see the same sort of things going on in Chicago in the film that was highlighted, but also in Detroit. And even as it relates to COVID, we're seeing issues around a lack of social infrastructure. So people not being able to be connected because they don't have internet. Who gets access to the information that says, hey, you should be careful, watch out for X, Y, and Z? Who gets access to the information that even says where the resources are if you don't have internet access? And so in Detroit, we see extreme poverty showing up in access to information, which is the most fundamental building block of any democracy. We're seeing people not have access to jobs, but even those who have access to jobs are working jobs that are giving increased exposure to COVID and other situations. And so, you know, people who don't have jobs aren't able to get the sort of benefits that they deserve, who don't have the social capital to demand more. And even if they do have a job, a lot of those jobs are on the front lines and are exposing them at disproportionate rates. And then I think also one of the similarities is just how important and how just how vulnerable our senior population is. It was mentioned before the high rises that we have, that a lot of the senior homes are high rises where folks are at increased risk of exposure to heat and other exposures. But also just think about the isolation that a lot of seniors are experiencing in the city of Detroit. It's something that's concerning. And the last similarity that I think is important to point out is just the political infrastructure itself is inadequate. You know, the thing that keeps on sticking now in my mind is how Mayor Daley was chuckling, laughing. He didn't feel the pressure or the ramifications of how inadequate his response and the city's response was, because he knew that either way he would be fine politically. And you saw that when it came to the death totals. You know, there was blowback, but there wasn't significant political blowback for him. He continued to try to undermine the data and the science that was coming out. And I think that really just shows a brazenness and sort of the capture of political and the concentration of political power that we also see in Detroit. Who and what types of people, which neighborhoods, what parts of the city, what parts of the region are listened to. And I think in Detroit, when it comes to the region, when you compare Detroit to a lot of the other cities throughout the region, and when you compare the neighborhoods, that's a recurring narrative and theme in Detroit political life, we're seeing just different responses and different rates and different rates of access to resources in different neighborhoods that I think is concerning. So I think overall, just the same lack of social infrastructure, food deserts, lack of access to jobs, internet is something that we also see in Chicago. And then also just the political infrastructure being inadequate and the capture and the concentration of that political power that's made it hard for people to fight back and to demand more from their government is something that is super concerning for me.
Right. Thank you, Justin, and you've highlighted a huge number of issues, but I think one of the key points is the cumulative impact of all of the social, political, economic, informational divides as they combine to shape both the risk of exposure and then the ability to have resources to try to dig out or recover from those exposures. I'm going to turn to our final panelist, Trish Koman. Trish, would love to hear your comments, your opening comments about the film and your reactions.
I want to thank you, Amy, for that introduction, and I want to express my gratitude to the organizers and to Detroit Public TV and Judith, especially for your inspiring film, a really very powerful film, and to my fellow panelists for your remarks. You know, how do I see the heat wave of Chicago in 1995 as being relevant to Detroit and today? in many ways, the film is telling us the story of what we don't want to see and don't want to be. But sadly, I think that it seems very relevant to what we're seeing today. And even more so because climate change is increasing the likelihood that these types of heat waves and other disasters are going to continue across the country. In the last 35 years, the US has had 258 weather and climate related disasters where the damage and costs have reached or exceeded $1 billion. And that doesn't tell the story of the human suffering that goes along with all of that. I think that this is not just the story about Chicago or even the story of Detroit. This is really our story in so many places. And we can't speak about climate change in the US without talking about racial discrimination. And I think the film really brought that home. Communities with large minority populations are among the most vulnerable in the US, especially to the effects of climate change, and could become even more threatened with the current COVID pandemic weakening their resilience. And this has been supported by NOAA and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's own data. So this is a really important issue for the US to be thinking about. And I want to offer up a couple ideas. I think that this film helps us to visualize an often unseen but very powerful set of forces that intersect. So I want to make 3 points that I think other panelists have also brought forward. The first factor that intersects is health. And as a society, we really need to focus on health as a core value. And we need to focus on justice as a core value. And because our climate is our life support, we need to be thinking about our climate as a climate determinant of health. In public health, we often talk about social determinants of health, but there's an even more fundamental piece here that we need to be thinking about the climate and the way that it creates the conditions for our life and that profoundly affect the health and well-being of our community. Climate change is often described as a threat multiplier, and for low wealth areas and communities of color, that threat multiplier is especially of concern. So, as others have said, at the core of that is warming of our world, and we can do something about that. And we know that this warming is already increasing extreme heat and heat-related cardiovascular death and disease, especially in vulnerable groups. And those populations include the elderly and children, outdoor workers, people who suffer from obesity or diabetes or other chronic diseases that have social patterning to them, and that these disparities stem from social conditions. So we need to be thinking about that intersectionality with health and justice. The second point I wanted to make is that I think a key message from the film is the idea that Amy brought up, that cumulative effects matter, and they matter to our health very profoundly. So we have to think about how the social and the physical factors work together at the same time. So as a scientist, we often try to isolate specific factors, but communities experience these things all together. They experience racial discrimination and the heat and the buildings that they live in and the access to internet or not, or the access to political power or not, all at the same time. And we have to really think about how all of this works together and cumulatively affects people's health. And the third important takeaway, I think, from the movie is that we really need to reimagine public safety around primary prevention. So we don't want to wait, as the doctor in the trailer said, until the refrigerated trucks are rolling in. We've got to work upstream. We've got to get to the root causes of things, and we've got to take action now to be sure we're building the most healthful communities that we can. And we know how to do this. And I think that the solutions are at hand. And I think we need to be really thinking through what actions do we need to take.
Great. Thank you, Trish. And thanks to all of our panelists for beginning us with a brief set of comments about the film. I want to, before we move to our next question, I just want to invite the panelists. We have a whole set of things that you've put on the table related to differentials in access to political power, to economic power, to social conditions, driving factors related to climate change, and racism as a fundamental underlying factor for many of the others that we've talked about. And I just want to give the panelists a moment, if you would like to have a little conversation amongst yourselves about that, in some ways, huge set of factors that come into play, and whether there are connections or underlying issues that we can think about that are connected to multiple, maybe multiple ones of those.
So I will say, just to start us off, the first thing that comes to my mind is just our history with racial segregation. You know, the book Color of Law, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, kind of lays out very, very, very clearly that, you know, it's no accident that we're racially segregated as a city, as a region. And I think that racial segregation has resulted in people being near toxic waste facilities. So it's resulted in environmental injustice. In a lot of cases, especially in the Detroit area, it's resulted in police enforcing those boundaries. 8 Mile being a very clear demarcation between where Detroit is and where the suburbs is, where white people are and black people. So when we think about police violence, I think it ties into racial segregation. And then education as well, and poverty as well, and that revolving door and cycle between not having enough property taxes to fund an education system that's well funded, and how that just cycles and continues the cycles of all the sorts of injustices that we see. So I think racial segregation is one of the factors that I think ties in a lot of these different themes.
Thank you, Justin. Other members of the panel?
Yeah, so this is Trish. I'll jump in here. So I think that one of the very powerful lessons also is that communities have a lot of experience and answers within themselves. And we really need to be listening to the community. And I think that came out pretty strongly in the film, and comes out through a lot of different work. And I think that the impacted communities have important lessons about what will work and how we can reimagine public safety to include ways to create healthier communities. And we can think about the physical built environment and also these social structures. And oftentimes people think of these as a given, like it always has to be this way. And I think that the recent events are really opening a lot of people's eyes in the way I think this film tried to do, that it doesn't always have to be this story, that the story doesn't have to end this way, that we can do better.
Thank you, Trish. Judith or Jalonne, either of you want to jump in on this before we move to our next?
Jalonne, do you want to go for, no.
You can go first, Judith, please.
Well, you know, the thing that has been going through my head while I'm listening is, it's somewhat counterintuitive. There's so many schools that have been closed on the south side of Chicago and on the west side of Chicago. So many libraries that have either been shut down or their hours are cut down, in very, they open at 12 and they're not open first thing in the morning, and they close maybe at 5, and maybe they're not open on Sundays. So I'm thinking about sort of the anchor institutions that really keep a community vital and alive and healthy, and really, sort of supports the next generation, and is there for like the little kids and the elders, who are two very vulnerable populations within a community. And so when I think about what could we do to help, to help turn this tide and to change this, it's all about investing in anchor institutions and investing in, local businesses and local economic health. And I know, will they be better off during a heat wave if there's a school? And I think the answer is actually yes. Will they be better off if there's a vibrant library that has a very active social life and people feel very safe going there? Yes. So anything that builds social cohesion and builds community is going to mean that the community is going to be healthier on every level. So, when I listen to all of this, like, what's the best form of disaster preparedness? It's really good public schools that really, make for equity. It's really good public institutions that really help keep a community vibrant. So that's some of what I've been thinking about. Now, those are also places that become cooling centers, which that now are going to become very complicated in this time of COVID when people can't gather, which means that creating public spaces and, that are really for the public, that are safe and vibrant, that are inviting people out and that can help them stay cool. It's really about it's really about the public good and what we consider to be part of our, public life. And when you divest in it in every step of the way, that's what helps make people sick. And it's also what saves people during a heat wave.
Yeah, oh my God. So Judith, you took me to another trail. So what I was going to say, all good stuff, is really the importance of investing in people. Because how many times have we seen a crisis happen? And who are the first responders? It's not the government, it's not the police, it's not FEMA, it is the community. And so how do we begin to realize the value of investing in people who are functioning as first responders, even in this COVID crisis, even in the water crisis in Detroit, and really help build up and shore up those informal networks that exist? Because those are the folks, those are the community resilience hubs that are going to keep people through these crises, whether it's a snowstorm, a heat wave, COVID, or whatever. So thinking about from a funding perspective, and the infrastructure is critical, the physical infrastructure. When you talk about flooding, again, you have to have a wall, proper sewage, drainage, green infrastructure. When you talk about heat, we look at the infrastructure of the home, which is supposed to be safe, but in most cases is not for a lot of people. So how do we, again, appreciate what the physical infrastructure needs to be, but also invest more in the people that are actually going to help save lives in the time of crisis? So I think in terms of what Trish said, in terms of the solutions coming from those that are being impacted the most, that is so true. And we have to invest in that. So is there a way, not only as a foundation, not only as an institution, not only as government, that we begin to invest in people in these places and not just the stuff that we're used to investing in that is not really saving the lives that, we're obviously continuing to lose to a bunch of different things?
I mean, that's one of the reasons why I chose the disaster preparedness frame, because one reason is every community in this country post 9/11 has a disaster preparedness infrastructure, even at the most local level, and they all have budgets. And everyone will say, oh, come on, you can't compare that budget to X budget, but those budgets are somewhat fluid. And if and it all depends on how you define disaster and how you define disaster preparedness. So investing into the general operating support of the local community organizations that are always going to be the first ones to respond and who become the frontline workers and are bringing, the masks and the food and are ensuring to the best of their knowledge that their social network that they're accountable for is as safe as they could possibly be. They might not right now be becoming, frontline workers for COVID, but they're actually could be a literacy organization. They actually might be doing girls empowerment. They could be a dance organization. They could be so many other things that I know are going on in Detroit. And when they needed to, they pivoted, which is a great example of why investing in one of those organizations, they will be there for the disaster, but they'll be there for everyday life too. And that's the preparedness that we need. It's not more, we need the masks, but what we really need is to invest in that literacy organization that has face-to-face contact with girls and their families all across Detroit every single day.
So I think Judith is really moving us nicely to the next segment of the conversation, and I want to invite Zachary to put up the slide that we had earmarked for this conversation. The The slide is from the film, and it's actually from the book, the 1995 Chicago heat wave.
Actually, it's from the office of Dr. Steve Whitman. May he rest in peace.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think has been published in a few places. So thank you, Judith, for that correction. So this film shows Chicago neighborhoods, and in the shaded areas, you can see these are the neighborhoods that experience the highest death rates during the 1995 Chicago heat wave. And then the black circles show neighborhoods which have the highest percentage of people who are living with incomes below the poverty line. And the map, is intended to illustrate the synergy between risk of mortality in the heat wave and poverty. And we're beginning to move in this conversation towards thinking about what is it that we might learn about, what lessons could we take from the 1995 Chicago heat wave in order to think about what can we do to prepare now for what we anticipate are increasing likelihood and increasing frequency of high heat events in the context of Detroit and other communities as we move into the future. And I think I want to just call out a phrase that Judith uses in the film and that is often used in public health, the idea of a slow motion disaster. So we often think of disasters as these events that happen suddenly, a Katrina, a Hurricane Harvey, but the idea of a slow motion disaster is a disaster that we can see coming a long time before the events actually unfold and become catastrophic. And I think we can think about poverty and we could think about racial segregation as slow motion disasters and the disinvestment that happens in urban communities as a result of those. So I'd like to now turn back to the panel and invite us to all think about this map and the correlation between poverty and mortality, and think a little bit about, are there lessons? What are the lessons that we might be able to take from that heat wave as we think forward about opportunities to be more prepared for what we can anticipate will be coming in the future?
So I think maps are really powerful tools to help communities understand what's going on. In my own research, we use a lot of geospatial maps to try to help communities understand the connections. And one of the things that we've been talking about is different types of public organizations. And sometimes what we find is the people responsible for the roads and who might be making choices about whether there's dark colored asphalt in communities or other types of things, or different colored roofing, are different people than the organizations and government groups that might be dealing with more the social side of things. So sometimes separating those apart to help the bureaucracies understand the different pieces can be helpful. But as I said when I was opening, we need to be thinking about the intersection of all these things as well, how they fit together, how they're socially patterned. And maps are a good way to help people start to grapple with that and start to understand it. And so I think that public health uses a lot of maps to understand factors as they relate to disease. And a lot of these things are spatially patterned because of the ways in which the United States has been discriminating in its settlement patterns over the years in housing and other.
Thank you, Trish. I just want to raise up a comment that's come in from our audience, and it's a comment, not a question, but the comment is racial segregation was written into the plan for most major cities. And I think that resonates with the point that you're making, Trish, that we see a social patterning of many of these phenomena, and they tend to cluster. They're correlated with each other spatially as a result of that segregation. Other members of the panel, Justin, Jalonne, Judith.
Come on, Justin.
Okay, you can see me almost about to, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is is the quotation. I'm going to get it wrong, I'm sure, but the gist of it was that this isn't rocket science, that we know what the problems are, that really this is a question of political will. And I think, as an organizer, that's the first thing that comes to my mind, is that we already know what needs to happen, especially with heat events. People need to be hydrated, they need water, they need adequate housing, and they need access to infrastructure like cooling centers, and they need to be in touch with other folks. And so social cohesion is important. And so policy-wise, the first things that come to my mind is our issue with housing, access to affordable housing. The city of Detroit is, overtaxed residents $600 million over many, many years, and that's pushed a lot of families into vulnerable situations. People have lost their homes. People have been moved into homes that aren't of good quality as a result. And so I think that is an issue that relates to housing that we need to address. On the waterfront, there are thousands of families that have had their water cut off over many years, and it is a slow-moving disaster to think about not having access to water during a major heat event, or during a major pandemic, or any sort of emergency. And so things like access to water affordability. There have been a lot of folks locally working on that issue in Detroit, and I think that this moment, COVID, as well as just the lessons from this film, tell us that we need to move urgently on that issue as well. So water, access to clean and affordable water, as well as just access to affordable housing, are two issues that I think are urgent for Detroiters, that also tie into a lot of the lessons from the film that we saw.
I mean, the thing about, this map was kind of ground zero, if you will, in our movie, but we show another map later on in the film, which is a redlining map for the city of Chicago. And the neighborhoods that were redlined are pretty much the same neighborhoods that had the most heat deaths. And then we go forward, and we use this map as a basis, and the same neighborhoods that were redlined for Black and brown people are the same neighborhoods that had the most heat deaths, are the same neighborhoods going forward that have the most empty lots, the most boarded up buildings, the most school closures, the most amount of people that are incarcerated currently or were incarcerated, the most amount of people who are dying of breast cancer. They're not dying of breast cancer on the north side. The most amount of people that are dying of heart disease, treatable diseases that white people on the other side of town aren't. When we made the movie and Dr. Whitman was explaining all these maps, and he would often say, it's all the same map. It's the same map. And if we put COVID on top of that map in Chicago, or we put COVID on top of the similar map in Detroit, I would venture to say, it's the same map. So I think it's when you bundle all of them together and you see the multiple pressures and the multiple things that are causing people on one side of town to die, on the other side not to die. I mean, that's enough of a disaster. We don't need a pandemic on top of it. Like, we already had a pandemic. But I think the reason why we need an isolated map is very important, but I think people have to see the compressed map to understand really what the long-term cumulative effect of all of that is. And then we need to know exactly where to put that investment, right? I mean, like, there you go. It's right there. Like, which I think often policymakers run in the other direction.
So one area where policymakers are actually looking at this would be in California, where they're using these kinds of cumulative environmental mapping exercises to make policy change. So economic theory tells us that there'll be winners and losers in a capitalistic society, and that it's okay if the winners can essentially compensate those who are not winners. I don't agree with that, but that's the way the theory works. And the idea is that polluters, for example, might pay a fee that then is going into funds that goes back to communities. So there's different ways to think about how to fund the necessary changes that need to be made. We're all connected. And so we need to be thinking about how we can work together in order to have the vibrant communities that we all want for all people in our area and our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jalonne.
I'm sorry, Amy, were you going to move on?
I was going to raise a question from the audience, but if this is on the same point, please go.
Yeah, so gosh, so much. So there's just a couple things that I wanted to bring up. The first thing, you know, the main lesson for me in this movie is that we do not need history to repeat itself. I think it was Justin that said, I mean, it is not rocket science. Like, and I love science and I love research, but we don't need another set of research or maps to show us who is getting impacted the most. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I think it's a point that you bring out in the documentary beautifully, is that oftentimes the wrong people are being blamed for the problems that we're seeing. And I spent some time working with an environmental justice organization in DC. And again, I was just so bothered because it was always the Black and brown person's fault. They decided to live near this incinerator, or they're eating the wrong things. They're, you know, all this blame on Black and brown people, and it is not their fault. So first of all, we need to place the blame where the blame is actually accurate and true, because that's not the fact. The other thing is, you know, in addition to straight up racism as being the root of all this, we need to focus on, in my opinion, building the general health of the community. Because if we have healthier people, a lot of these kind of pre-existing illnesses combined with all this other stuff, we will begin to hopefully see better health outcomes. But if we don't start just building up the health of our individual people, making sure that there's a solid health infrastructure, that there are clinics, affordable insurance, all this stuff, that is a critical piece as well. And I think that is a lesson that we're going to continue to learn until we invest as much in our schools, in our health infrastructure system. And then I would also say accountability. Like, how awful is it that certain people stay and remain in leadership positions and things happen and nothing changes? How can we begin to hold these folks accountable at all levels of government for the fallacies that we are seeing in our communities across this country? And last but not least, if something is not working, and I'm talking in terms of systems and policies and plans, then we need to be bold enough to change it. And I feel like we just spin our wheels. And again, if it's not working, we need to change it. If it's not protecting people, if it's not protecting health, if we're investing in the wrong things, we can't be scared to flip our script and do something different.
Thank you, Jalonne. I think that this, and I'm glad you went first, because I think that this question that I'm going to bring up from someone in the audience really builds on the point that you just made. So the comment is, as a 77-year-old educated Detroit resident, I was not aware of the life-threatening effects of heat. Awareness of environmental extremes must be communicated to all communities by representatives of the specific groups who speak the same language. A man in the film said they don't get federal funding for such disasters, and I think he's referring to slow motion disasters or disasters like poverty, because it must be proven that the disaster wasn't brought on by individuals, and that he would be right there behind Judith if that policy was changed. And the question then is that really the solution? And if so, is advocacy/lobbying the only answer? And then the second question is, or how do we, and in quotes, convince the government that these disasters are due to structural racism, which was certainly not brought on by Blacks, which I think resonates with the point of what we in public health tend to call victim blaming, blaming people to whom bad things happen for the fact that that thing happened to them. So I wonder if anyone wants to tackle that question, and I'm going to maybe pick on you, Justin, since you're a community organizer. The first question here is about advocacy, lobbying. Jalonne, I know you have some experience and background in that area also, and others, of course, feel free to weigh in.
So a couple of things come to my mind. I think the first thing is that I personally think advocacy is the most important link in making sure that we change a lot of these systematic issues. But I also would be remiss to not recognize that churches, that schools, that nonprofits, people find infrastructure, social infrastructure, in a lot of different areas of the community that are important and that aren't simply connected to government. And so I think there definitely is a role to play for institutions that are community led, that are community built, that are community funded, and that are not directly tied to government. But I do think that government action, government being the way we all make decisions collectively, is the most important link in addressing the systematic racism that has shown through all of the issues that we're discussing. And to the question of how do we convince government that these disasters are due to structural racism, I struggle between educating and convincing and showing the data. I struggle between that, and also I'm at the point where if people don't recognize that structural inequality, structural racism is real, they don't deserve to be to be in government. That there's a certain degree of convincing that I don't think we should be willing to or accepting of. I think we need to certainly elect and advocate for leaders who understand our issues when it comes to systematic racism and inequality. But I think a lot of times it's just folks are turning a blind eye to things that we already know exist. We know the history, we know the data. It's a matter of priorities, it's a matter of political will. And I think advocacy, I think lobbying, I think organizing is the way that we restructure a lot of the priorities that government officials have, given what we know about the true cost of all of this. The last thing I'll say is that I think one of the big lessons from this film is that all of this inequality has a cost on our society. The cost of programs, after school programs to make sure kids are safe, the cost of programs to make sure seniors are getting the engagement they need and that they're taken care of, and the cost for resiliency hubs, all of this. One of the things that we hear is that it costs a lot. It costs a lot to address climate change. It costs a lot to address environmental injustice, and it costs. But we're seeing the real cost of not doing anything, of letting these issues fester. And those issues and those costs compound. So I think one of the things that we have to do is to try to shift the conversation and shift the narrative, that all of the things that we're demanding are costly, because for over 700 people to die, all concentrated in one area of the city, that to me is something that you can't even quantify in terms of cost. So I think we definitely have to push levers of government, have to build up systems, nonprofit and social and church-based initiatives outside of government, and then we also have to shift the conversation.
Thank you, Justin.
Well, I love that question. Thank you very, very much for it. I want to say there's a number of cities, in Wisconsin, St. Louis, that amazing Milwaukee, Wisconsin, actually most of Wisconsin, who have declared racism a public health crisis. And they actually went through the whole process of making a declaration. And in fact, Cook County, not the city, but Cook County, Chicago, also declared racism a public health crisis. And part of the reason that they've done that, and I think it's so much more clear to the whole world right now after COVID, and after what we've just seen in the last couple of weeks. But the reason they did that is because, they realized, okay, public health gets funded. If you don't want to invest in communities that have been completely robbed of their health because of structural racism, but you are willing to invest in public health, let's reframe it. And my whole movie is sort of about that. It's questioning whether or not it's possible to reframe disaster, because we know how to respond to a disaster. We're hardwired for it, so to speak. So, to some extent, I mean, that there's sort of lobbying that's doing that. If you do that and you go that far, then I don't see why you can't lobby for more public health, for the kind of community health workers that are shown in the movie, who you could imagine would be so important if they became the people who were helping, like the 77-year-old person who asked that question, if in their voice, because they live in the community and they're of the community and their job is to help people understand what heat can mean and how they need to keep safe and how to use the social networks at hand in order to try and do that, whether it's post-COVID or whether it's during COVID or before. I mean, like, those people could help save lives, and they'd be being paid to be those kind of community health workers who are focused on specifically addressing asthma or heart disease or breast cancer or AIDS, you know, or the myriad kinds of illnesses that go along with a very racist society. So my hope is that if we could invest in those kind of community organizations, and I look towards you, Jalene, because if the government isn't willing to do that, I do think that right now philanthropy can. The Ford Foundation just borrowed billions of dollars so that they could invest in communities because they're not waiting for the government to do that right now. So, you know, I feel like the models are there, and the community-based models, if invested in and ratcheted up, can be very, very effective and could address multiple problems all at the same time. And think about heat at the same time. So, I mean, I think we have to think about, you know, yes, lobbying, but I think we have to sort of look at the community institutions that can be invested in, that can help address a lot of these issues in really strategic ways.
Thank you, Judith. I think your comments are really a great segue into the last clip that we wanted to share to kind of frame this conversation. We want the last part of our conversation to be really digging in and thinking about what are the multiple strategies that we could use to address some of these issues if we were to seriously reframe the ways that we think about disaster. So I'm going to invite Zachary to play the last clip, and then we'll come back and have a conversation about specific strategies.
I started this film questioning our very definition of disaster, and I'm ending it, convinced that if we just enlarge that definition, we could address the underlying conditions that are literally killing people every day. Because the word disaster typically moves people to respond quickly, with courage, compassion, and cold, hard cash. And if we responded to slow motion disaster the way we do a sudden natural one, the odds of saving a life just in the city of Chicago would be at least 3,200 to 1, no matter the weather. So what's the best way to prepare for disaster? Or for that matter, recover from one? I guess it depends on where you live and the kind of world we want to live in.
Theo, don't do that.
Okay. All right. So I think that it's a great clip, and we really chose it because it kind of crystallizes and encapsulates a lot of what this film is about and a lot of what this conversation has been about. Do we choose to wait until a large-scale sudden disaster occurs before we go in and start to think about how do we aid in the recovery? Justin's already highlighted some of the inequalities that repeatedly we see in those situations where more resource communities tend to be less hard hit, and often are those that have easier access to resources to recover. Or can we think about this idea of a slow motion disaster? Many of the things that we've been highlighting so far in this conversation really are about that kind of slow motion disaster, which then plays out not only in a single health outcome, a heat wave, mortality due to a heat wave, but those same dynamics are in play when we see excess COVID deaths, when we see excess mortality due to any number of health conditions. And I think, Judith, it was you who talked about how the maps are all the same, right? We see the same kinds of vulnerabilities expressed no matter what health outcome we look at. This panel has already highlighted a number of strategic actions that could be taken. We've talked about investing in people. We've talked about investing in communities. We've talked about investing in institutions. We've talked about investing in physical infrastructure to make changes that we know shape vulnerability. And we've talked a bit about political advocacy. And so I think this is our opportunity to come back as a panel and really dig in and think about what recommendations do you have related to specific short and or long-term strategic actions that could be taken to address some of the inequities that we see playing out in the Chicago heat wave film, and also as we're currently experiencing the pandemic in Detroit.
Amy, if I can, I just want to go back to something Judith said before the
Absolutely.
clip, and then I'll step away and maybe respond to the question after the other panelists. But Judith, I appreciate you, kind of bringing up, like the role of philanthropy. And what I will say, and I'm very proud to say that, again, while philanthropy can't do it all, oftentimes our role, in my opinion, is to come in and fill the gap where government and other folks have kind of not been able to take care of certain things. So we fill the gap, we take risk. That's we come in again in times like this. And what I will say is that we have been supporting the Michigan Community Health Workers and a National Nurses Association to do just that. To get trained up in understanding the impacts of climate, along with all the other wonderful stuff that they do. So I'm really excited about the Michigan Community Health Workers and what they're going to be able to do in terms of that, another infrastructure of public health support. But I do want to recognize that, like many institutions, philanthropy has their own troubled history, where most of the money that has come into these foundations was not in a good way. So again, how do we as philanthropy step in to try and fill the gaps? How do we own our own institutional racism and structural issues? And then I think, again, how does that really begin to, once we look at ourselves in the mirror, how can we then begin to actually work on our mission, which at Kresge is to advance opportunities for low-income communities? And that's going to, it's going to be a different mission for every foundation. So I think in the short term, it's taking institutions like foundations, like, hospitals, health systems, educational institutions to take a real hard look in the mirror and figure out what are the barriers, both invisible and visible, that are keeping me from serving the community that I'm supposed to. And I think acknowledging that and then actually doing something about it is kind of the first step when you talk about dismantling, again, these systems and structures that are causing all this mess. But I think, for me, while I want to think in short and long term, all of this stuff is so imminent, like I think we need to work on multiple things in tandem. So whether it's making sure that our leaders understand the intersectionality between COVID, climate, racism, whatever, that's super important. And I just remember going into many offices in DC where I already knew that I really wasn't going to be able to kind of change this viewpoint. And so I think we need to, again, continue to educate folks, but go where we have the traction. And that might not be all the time at the federal level, but it might be at the local level where folks are a little bit more malleable and can move stuff. So I think education is key. As an engineer, I truly believe in planning. It's not just the response and after, but how do we really begin to plan? And that planning has to include, again, community voice. It has to include not just the engineers, but public health folks, social workers, all the pieces that, again, mental health, all these folks need to be at the table when you're doing these plans. And then I would say for my municipal leaders and governmental leaders, really taking a look at the policies and procedures that you have in place and seeing, what's working and what's not working. Because right now, one of the imminent issues is around COVID recovery packages, stimulus funds, and we have already seen, how monies are not getting where they need to go. So how can we begin to change these processes at the higher level that will ultimately get resources down to the folks that really need it? And I think this is both it's showing, again, the jacked upness of our processes, but it's also an opportunity because as we're making these tweaks and switches during a crisis, we might find something that actually works better. So how do we keep the good stuff and institutionalize that so then ultimately resources and whatever we're trying to get flowing to folks that really need it and not just to folks that are using it to kind of buffer and cushion can actually happen. So those are just some of my quick thoughts, but I appreciate Judith, and I encourage folks to hold your institutions accountable, and I say that because we are not perfect, but hold us accountable. So thank you.
So I want to reflect on another piece of what Judith had to say about the role of public health. And public health workers do tremendous, tremendous work, and community health workers are really, doing awesome things. But public health has been cut in terms of funding. The Institute of Medicine and the National Academies of Science have documented how across the country we're continuing to cut public health. And in the current pandemic, we found out what happens when you don't have adequate public health. And also when you're thinking about medical treatment instead of public health prevention. So one of the things that I hope that we can take away from the film and from our discussion is we do have to start reimagining public safety to be preventative. And we haven't yet even touched on the idea that we need to reduce carbon. We need to really go upstream and do what we can to preserve our climate by reducing our carbon pollution. And we can do that in many different ways, but we need leadership at the state and local levels. We need leadership in our cities. We need leadership at the federal level, and we need to stop rolling back all of the progress that we've made. And so really focusing on prevention in very upstream way, we need to do what we can to mitigate the worst effects of climate, to really try to stop in its tracks this warming and the heat that we'll be having across the globe, especially impacting vulnerable communities around the planet.
Come on, Justin.
I really agree with the point you made, especially about climate. For me, I think that's a really important issue that intersects health and also the resiliency topic that we've been touching on. I think in terms of poverty on the 10,000 foot level, on the federal level, I think there have been a lot of interesting proposals like baby bonds that would try to address a lot of the systematic lack of resources that people have. I think we definitely need to talk about how we tax people. For me, I think that people who have a lot should give a little bit more. And I think that the initiatives that we've been talking about need to be funded by government. And so I think we can't talk about that without talking about our tax system and how we fund these programs. I think also just on a local level, I touched on this earlier, but there are issues around access to water. Access to water is a human right. And then housing, affordable housing, the fact that residents have been overtaxed by millions of dollars, and how that's made a lot of people vulnerable, pushed a lot of people out. We're very familiar with what happened in 2008 and the housing crash and how that impacted people and made people vulnerable. And I think that we're going to see similar things from COVID, people not being able to pay bills, people losing, years and years and decades of wealth. And I think that certainly needs to be addressed in the immediate future. I do like what was said earlier that for me, all these issues are so urgent. So it's very, very hard to say that we should do these things in the long term. I think all these issues are urgent and we need to address them immediately. The last thing I'll say is that I think we really do have to reckon with not just our racial history going back 400 years and from slavery, but my grandmother, like 50 years ago, our racial history, the fact that that Black families were systematically kept out of certain neighborhoods, of accessing federal loans. When we talk about race, we talk about it like it was such a long time ago. But if you get a home from your parent or your grandparent, and that home was purchased because you were able to get a federal loan, the timeline and how we talk about things is just very off. So I think we need to reckon with that history, especially around FHA loans, and how that's impacted housing segregation, and in turn, environmental issues, poverty, and the lack of access to wealth and resources, and all those issues that lie beyond that foundation of housing segregation and inequality.
Thank you, Justin. It's a reminder that the issues are not just historical, but they are contemporary. They continue to be, and I think the Color of Law book that you mentioned is a case in point, and really makes that point clearly, that those laws are still on the books and those processes continue to unfold.
I'll tell you, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this movie if my father and mother didn't get a loan to buy, a $15,000, $20,000 house, in Merrick, Long Island, which was an all-white town next to an all-Black town. And they were specifically kind of encouraged to go to Merrick and not Freeport. So they went where they were encouraged to go, and they bought this little house, and they bought it on, the south side of Merrick Road, and they stayed there for 43 years. And when I went to college, they got an extra mortgage, so they could help me pay for it. And I didn't realize till years later, when I was in my 20s, that my town was completely redlined, and that there was a reason why Freeport was 80% Black, and why there was absolutely no Black kids at my school except for one family, or maybe two kids. Like, I didn't understand any of that, but only when I was making this movie did I realize that it was actually because of redlining, and we were beneficiaries of it, and a very, very middle-class, modest family. But just because they were able to stay in that house, they could sell it for, almost $400,000 43 years later, and then retire and use that money to pay for their retirement, and we didn't have to support them. And that's a very tiny example, but I wouldn't have made this movie actually without that loan for my dad to buy that house, and then they stayed there. So I think that part of why I inserted myself and my voices here, and I sort of take people on this trip, is because there's no doubt in my mind that the white people need to understand how we are beneficiaries. It's not just that redlining is a problem, but that we have been deep beneficiaries of it, and it has informed our lives for generations. I'm in a rent-stabilized apartment myself. I don't own it, but I just wanted to say that it's not far off history. That history enabled me to be me. But I am concerned about the incoming heat this summer, and whether or not the heat emergency plans are really taking COVID into consideration, and what resources people are really going to have. And to quote Eric Kleinenberg, he thinks that social distancing is a really bad term. He thinks it should be called physical distancing and social solidarity. He's really concerned, and we've talked about this, and we had a meeting with the city of Chicago to try to give them some ideas about opening up streets so that people would feel safe enough to go, stay on their block, that maybe really utilizing, which to some extent it happens, utilizing the fire hydrants if it's safe and it's possible to do that, because that might be the only cool water source for kids to cool off. For maybe taking the librarians who have been furloughed or are coming back, but people can't go into the library, and encouraging them to go street by street and doing programs for elders so that elders feel safe and want to come outside and be part of a program. I think we have to think about heat emergency in a different way, because if people stay inside and they can't cool off, they're going to die. So we have to figure out, what does physical distancing mean in the age of COVID when it comes to heat? And if there's a real way to create a human emergency plan that is maybe kind of directed and held by the community people, the people in the community who were the first ones out to take care of people during COVID, who really understand how their neighborhoods work, who really get it. And I think we have to invest in that kind of emergency community-based infrastructure for this summer in cities all across the country.
That's really a great idea. I had a chance with the American Public Health Association's conference in Philadelphia previously to see a community solution where elders in a local area had a road in front of them that was creating a barrier for them accessing a park that would have been a very cool place to be. And so the local planners asked them, well, what would it take to get you to cross the road? And, you know, a lot of them said, well, I remember growing up, my grandparents had a porch swing, and they would sit in their front porch and talk in the evening and everything. And so they ended up creating essentially a park-based set of porch swings that would be accessible for people who are elders, and created a very lovely space that managed water better, had shade, had that social cohesion, and you know, it really brought the community together. And before they knew it, people were having a community garden next to that, and then they would have cooking things and, you know, parties and just different ways for the community to come together, because the community wanted something that would work for them, and they really came up with a great solution. And it didn't take that much money, and it's, you know, saving so much and adding so much to that local area. So I think there's lots of really great ideas the community have for what will work for them and what will make it a vibrant place. And so I think we need more of that, especially as we're changing things now with COVID. We're going to be adapting. We're going to be adapting with climate, where we're going to have to do things differently. And why don't we take the best ideas, as Jalonne said, and, you know, really capitalize on them and do more.
But invest real money in it. I mean, I think, to Justin's point, I mean, we can't step away from the fact that it's going to take a major, huge federal investment, like huge, to try to turn this around, and it has to go to the people who've been most divested from.
I think this is a really wonderful place to end, to thinking about investing in communities, and to Trish's point, really amplifying the solutions that emerge out of communities, so that it's not someone outside the community who says, hey, I've got a great idea, let's do this, but the solutions to some of the issues emerge from the communities with resources that may come from outside the communities, but that lift up those solutions that that community members develop, and that really come out of their own insights and their own experiences and their own values. So I want to, first of all, really thank this amazing set of panelists for spending some time with us tonight and talking about this incredible film, and sharing your insights and thoughts and resources and all of your amazing ideas around how do we move forward in the face of some of the challenges that get really highlighted and crystallized in the context of the film, and I think are, as we've talked about today, still challenges that we confront, what are we, 30 years, 25 years later. I really want to thank everybody for your thought-provoking comments. Those of you in the audience who sent in phenomenal questions for us to engage and to think about, and your comments to help move forward this conversation. Zachary, if you will put up the slide at the end, I want to highlight a couple of resources for folks who may be interested in further conversation or digging into some of these issues a bit further. First, I want to lift up the COVID 313 group, which is a group that is mobilized with a number of resources in the Detroit community specifically in response to COVID-19. Go to their website. It's an incredible wealth of conversation. They also are hosting Thursday from 12 to 2 conversations, virtual town halls around COVID and related issues that are hosted by DPTV. So I encourage you to tune into those. I also want to highlight a set of recommendations that Justin was part of the team that pulled together, environmental and climate policy recommendations. These are recommendations made to the 2020 Democratic Party platform, a set of really phenomenal ideas about how do we move forward around climate justice in particular. So thank you, Justin, for that. We also have a map of Detroit cooling centers. These are cooling centers throughout the city, which are places where people can go if they become overheated. As Judith has highlighted for us, there are challenges around cooling centers in the time of COVID-19, and I think push us to really think about other creative kinds of solutions. Two other things here, the extreme heat fact sheet, which you can access, and the My Environment Heat Stress Vulnerability Mapping Tool, which Trish developed and looks at cumulative risk related to heat. I think we may have another page of resources. Yes. This is a conversation that is happening down the road, June 23rd to 25th, funded by the MacArthur Foundation, the Summer of Extremes, Racism, Health, Equity, and Heat. And I think there is one additional slide. I know we had another resource. No. We will add this in. The other resource that we wanted to call to your attention to is that the Detroit Green Task Force Climate Action Roundtable is hosting a conversation with Karina Richters, who is from Canada and a real leader in the city of Windsor around climate change issues. That conversation is happening Monday, June 15th at 11 a.m. We will get that information added to the site so you'll be able to access it moving forward. So once again, thanks to our panelists, thanks to all of you for joining us for this conversation tonight, and we look forward to continuing the conversation moving forward.
Can I add one thing?
Go ahead, Judith. We might be at it. Yeah.
Yeah. This July 13th is the 25th anniversary of the heat wave, and in honor of that, public television, Independent Lens, will be rebroadcasting the film nationally for a month, starting on July 13th, and we're hoping to do some anniversary activities around the country. So if you come to our website, cookthefilm.com, there should be some stuff up there soon.
Wonderful.
Thank
you,
you so
Judith.
much.
Thank you.